Carlene Johnson is associate editor for the Center Square and reports on state government in Washington, and she joins us now for the Center Square Daily. Carlene, you had quite the marathon to run last week as the legislature in Washington was wrapping things up. Go ahead and tell us all about it, including how much sleep you got over the weekend.
Oh my goodness. Well, let's see. The last week of session leading up was a 24 and a half hour overnight in the Washington State House of Representatives, where Senate Bill 6346, what's billed now as a tax on millionaires of 9.9% of their income above $1 million. So say you make $1.2 million, it's the $200,000 that's going to be taxed at nearly 10%, or combined household income. So you make, $600,000, your spouse makes $600,000, you're also going to get taxed on that, above point of $1 million. So yeah, 24 and a half hours. Greg, it was the longest session on the floor of either the House or Senate that we've ever had in the state of Washington. Somebody mentioned last week, in the last day of session, I think we had a session in the 1920s when we were arguing about how to build the state highways and whether we should have I-5 or Pacific Highway South, or how the highways would look. But it was a marathon. Ultimately, even though some Democrats crossed over to vote with minority Republicans, the Democrats have such a majority in the state of Washington. This income tax was getting rammed through no matter what.
Now, obviously, it wasn't just the millionaire's tax, as some may be calling it. We're seeing that issue pop up in states across the country, by the way, Carlene. So Washington could be an interesting bellwether here. But they also had a budget, right? I mean, they had a $2 billion budget hole they were looking to fill. What are some other things that taxpayers in Washington need to know because they weren't able to watch 24 plus hours of legislative session, but they're going to be paying the bill?
Yeah, they're going to be paying the bill. And interesting, because this was what we call our short session. In the state of Washington, we have the short session, and then every other year we have the longer session. So this was only a 60-day session when lawmakers are only required to go to a supplemental budget. And this is to say the budget we passed last year isn't going to be enough to cover what we thought it was going to, or maybe we've got a lot and we should give money back. We don't really do that here. But this is supposed to be sort of just kind of filling the holes and saying, we messed up here. We thought this was going to bring this much revenue. We've got the Department of Revenue saying this isn't going to fly. Fill in the holes. Instead, what we did here this session was add another $2 billion to the supplemental budget. And by projections that I've been seeing in the last 4 days, Greg, if we go out 4 years, we're going to be 10, even with the new revenue, even with the new taxes raised. And this is before the income tax takes effect, because I should mention this is not till 2029 revenue that we're going to see, the millionaire's tax take effect in the state of Washington, and to supposedly bring in $3 to $3.5 billion a year. But this is before that. They say we're going to be in a $10 billion deficit at current revenue projections and current spending levels in the state of Washington in 4 years. $10 billion if we don't do something. So we don't have a revenue problem here. Every time the revenue projections come in, they say, oh, you guys are doing great. Brought in, $800 million more than we expected in the last quarter that came in. We still have a spending problem such that the majority is going to say, now we've got another $800 million to work with. Let's spend that and then some. We're just not prioritizing any kind of fiscal responsibility here.
Well, I was going to ask, were there any conversations when they're passing the supplemental, or while they're looking to increase, almost 10% taxes on those making $1 million or more down the line by 2029? But was there any conversation about where to shore up spending, where to maybe cut inefficient programs, or how to make services more efficient for the taxpayers who are the ones paying the bill?
Well, the problem in the state of Washington is that the Republicans are in such a minority that the conversation is completely hijacked really by the majority. Every time that the Republicans bring up in any of these committees or floor debates ahead of final passage of these bills to say, wait a minute, we don't have a revenue problem. We've got a spending problem. We've got to rein it in. The theme that comes back from the other side is cuts on the federal level. Mind you, many of the cuts to Medicaid and some of the other programs that in Washington state are being reined in because we have fraud and some of the other issues that you've talked about, many of the other states have. Those things are going to be reined in by the federal government, but it hasn't even hit us yet. We still have the majority Democrats that have cut Medicare and Medicaid and some of the other programs for the most vulnerable in the state of Washington. They've cut that at the state level, and yet they have hijacked the language to say the reason why we need to backfill all these programs is because, the orange man's bad on the federal level, even though that stuff is not realized yet here in the state of Washington. The problem is the Republicans are not able to, I guess, capture the truth of that conversation, and they don't have most of the mainstream media on their side. We've tried at the Center Square to do our best during the session to sort of highlight the issues that would bring truth to the conversation. And you mentioned the income tax. We started with that. I have to say, there's going to be immediate legal challenges once the governor signs this into law, Greg, and there is likely to also be a citizen initiative campaign. They made this thing referendum proof by emergency clause, so we can't do a referendum, but we can do an initiative in the state of Washington. It will require a lot of signatures, but based on all the polling I've seen, there is more than enough people that want to get this thing overturned.
Yeah, I think that was going to be kind of where I was going next. Is you've got several years here before it's supposed to go into effect, and I imagine between now and then, Carlene, you're going to be busy tracking court cases and all the twists and turns of where exactly
job security.
No, and it's going to be important because again, the taxpayers in Washington states, they got to go to work to their 9-to-5 job, and by the time they get home, they've got things to take care of at the house and kids to feed and so on, and they can't do what we do each and every day at the Center Square, which is take a look closer at state government and how it's impacting taxpayers. Yep. So it's really going to be important to track those court cases to see where this exactly is going. But Carlene, obviously with the income tax issue, you've got all the questions about how it impacts small businesses, and in particular, those small businesses who may one year make $800,000 while the business owner's only taking home $40,000 in a salary, but the way it's classified, they are putting on the books that, hey, their sole proprietor business is making $800,000, but then the next year, maybe they make $1.2 million. Is that going to incentivize, business investment and making sure that those businesses thrive?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was one of the main things during the amendments that were brought up, even on the last day of the legislative session before this thing passes, Greg. There were many, especially in central and eastern Washington, we have a lot of our more conservative districts. And these lawmakers are themselves farmers and egg producers. And they are the pass-through entities you just mentioned that are going to be on the hook for this. Because as you mentioned, you might have a good year for farming, a good crop. Say you made $1.5 million that year, you're going to, and then you pay obviously you pay all your egg workers, you pay off all your costs, you got your equipment, it's probably financed, you're paying all that. But if you have a good year and you want to expand and grow things, then you're going to reinvest that money, creating more jobs, more tax revenue for the state of Washington. But instead, these egg producers are going to be taxed on gross, not net profits, just like all the other smaller businesses are. So you have one good year, you get punished. That means you cannot reinvest and use that tax revenue to, create a wider tax line base for the state of Washington. And in the state of Washington right now, Greg, we are losing 2 to 4 of our farms every single day in the state of Washington. And I heard lawmaker after lawmaker, some of them tearfully beg for some exceptions in this bill for them so they can succeed, to no avail. None of those amendments were adopted. So unless the thing gets wholly overturned, either by the courts or by citizen initiative, we're just going to lose more and more of these good egg producers and farmers.
And it appears that, the question ultimately is coming down to, can the state of Washington even have this kind of income tax, right? Some of the Republicans you had talked to at the State House and other critics of this idea say that this is just not constitutional, that Washington does not have in their constitution the ability to tax that way.
It doesn't seem to matter. I brought it up in media avail after media avail with the majority leadership saying, wait a minute, our state constitution says that our income is our property. And I was told to my face with my direct questions to Senator Jamie Peterson, the Democrat who introduced Senate Bill 6346, he basically told me in that media avail, your income is not your property, because it's taxed at various levels already before it hits your bank account. So it's not really your property. And he created a series of interesting analogies, likening it somehow to illegal immigration. I'm not sure I tracked with everything that that path he went down. But at any rate, that's the argument. Our Constitution, the state of Washington, precludes this from happening. Right now, they're hoping, since we have such a left-leaning court, the hope is for majority Democrats that push this through, Greg, that they're going to find sympathy in the court that says we're going to overturn nearly 100 years of precedent in the state of Washington and say things have changed. Your income isn't your property in the state, and regardless of a constitutional amendment approved by the voters, this thing is good.
Well, Carlene, thank you so much for your time and for your reporting and staying up for those marathon sessions here in Illinois. We know those
I'm
far
still
too
tired.
often. I know it. It takes a long time to recover from that type of thing. Trust me, I know all about it. And we'll definitely be checking back in to see how this story and others from Washington continue. And viewers can keep up even closer with Washington State by tuning in to Washington in Focus Daily, only right here with the Center Square. Let's now welcome in Mike Noble, founder and CEO of Noble Predictive Insights, to give us those insights that he found from some of his latest polling. Mike, appreciate you joining us here for the Center Square Daily, and we'll talk about those latest numbers, but with the voter ID proposal expected to dominate headlines coming out of the U.S. Senate this week, what did you guys find out late last year about voter sentiment around voter ID and mail-in balloting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from the recent voter voice poll by the Center Square, which is a big national survey, we did over 2,000 respondents, and we found that Donald Trump is actually on the right side of the people when it comes to this issue. So not only Democrats are split on this issue, with 49% supporting it, with 41% opposing it, Trump's proposed voter ID requirement. Republicans, no surprise, they're unanimously on board with the president, 92 to 6%. Only 6% opposition, but the true tiebreaker, those true independents, so which is about 10-15% of the total electorate that don't lean one side or the other in the Republican Democrat fight, they're 3-1 in support of the president. So I don't agree with them that 100% of people support it, but the overwhelming majority are very much on board, and they're strong majorities among Hispanic Latino voters and African American voters.
It's interesting, the president using, kind of a type of polling. I don't know where he's getting his data, but, here's the president yesterday talking about this very issue.
The Save America Act, voter ID with a picture, right? That's a 99% issue. Even among Democrats, Democrats poll at 89% on that. And then they have proof of citizenship. And then they have no mail-in ballots. No mail-in ballots.
Yeah, the president known for being somewhat bombastic and speaking off the cuff, but you're indicating that he seems to be on the right trail. This is a very popular issue across the political spectrum.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly popular across the political spectrum, especially key voter blocks. Again, Hispanic Latinos, African Americans. But again, true independence, that swing vote, that's really important in general elections. And even Democrats are split on this issue, which is interesting and also telling. So he may be ingratiating just a little bit. However, he's not wrong to say, in the latest polling by the Center Square shows, voters are very much on board. And I think this is why it's a good issue. He's going to press it. And Democrats, this is kind of a bit of a loser for them politically.
Voter ID is just one issue, but he's also been pretty adamant about mail-in voting and saying that that needs to be restricted quite a bit. Tell us about that.
It's interesting. So this one is kind of a little juxtaposed to the previous issue. So Trump is dead on when it comes to requiring voter ID. However, I think he's on the opposite side when it comes to banning mail-in voting. Mail-in voting, decent support among Republicans, 77% in favor, 20% opposed. But basically the same amount are in opposition, though, of Democrats. So the Republicans and Democrats kind of cancel each other out. They're very polarized on this mail-in voting issue. But those all-important independents, by about 50 to 36, they're in opposition against the proposed ban. And what's even more interesting, when you look at the Western U.S., the broad mail-in vote that has much more broad mail-in voting habits compared to some other areas, like in states like Arizona and Nevada, they've been doing early voting a lot longer than some of these new states, post-COVID. And we saw that among the Western U.S., there's definitely a bit more of opposition to this ban, especially the folks that have been around it and seen it for a little bit. There's more opposition there compared to the newcomers to mail-in voting.
Another issue that you guys with Noble Predictive Insights found late last year in the polling for the Center Square was about election integrity and trust in elections. And some interesting data you guys found there, especially as we're now in that 2026 election year.
Yeah, it's interesting with when it comes to trust in elections. Like Republicans are now more confident in the fairness of elections. Actually, 72% of Republicans are actually more confident in the upcoming 2026 elections compared to Democrats. Only 47% of them are confident, and those independents in the middle, 45%. So interestingly, just a few years ago, Republicans were the biggest negative Nancy's when it came to confidence in elections. However, 2024 turned out pretty well for them from an electoral win standpoint, and now they're actually feeling very bullish regarding the upcoming election, where Democrats and independents a little more tepid in their confidence. So interesting world we live in.
No question, especially in your insights with the polling you've done. 2,500 people polled, and just the mix that you have of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, including those true independents. And I do want to touch on that here in a moment to kind of drill down a little bit on some of the absolute latest data that you have for the Center Square. But here's the president talking about how he wants to have the voter ID law brought up and to restrict mail-in voting, but he's also injecting a few other ideas that he's said he wants to amend that bill with. And here he is again yesterday in the Oval Office.
Then I added on no men playing in women's sports, and I added in no transgender surgery, the mutilation of our children. We have no mutilation of our children, no transgender. I think they say that's an 80% issue. I think they're 99% issue.
Again, Mike, he says it's a 99% issue to, not mutilate children with transgender issues and the men and women's sports issue. How far off is he, or is he also on the right track there?
Again, this is another one. He's not wrong on that. The majority of the public is against, the integration of transgender sports, so they believe in banning that. However, it's not 100%. I mean, I've been doing polling for decades, and I would say that I have yet to find any issue that's 100%. Like, even if you believe, like, hey, is freedom the most important thing in the United States? Like, you'll get like 98%. You're always gonna have a few percent off. But like this 2/3 of the electorate shows that they should allow, the Supreme Court should allow states and localities to be able to ban transgender women from competing in women's sports. I mean, that's not 100%. Well, I mean, again, that's a really good political issue. So again, I think he's in a good position on that one, but it's not 100. But 2/3 is pretty close.
Some other issues from the latest polling that you released just this month. And again, people can find this at thecentersquare.com. If you click on polls, you'll be able to read more about these and other issues. But the idea of, what is topping people's minds heading into this election, we'll touch on some of the breakdown there, but do people think that, it's inflation, or is it, some social issues like abortion? Break this down for us and what these key issues for voters really tells us that politicians need to be thinking about heading into the election in November.
Yeah, so when you look at this, there's a couple ways to ask top issue. What's your most important one? Or, hey, what's your top three? And I think how the Center Square asked it in the survey is probably the more realistic way. People usually have a couple issues that top their mark. So when we look at it, you see that what really screams out to me is that pocketbook issues are really the most front and center. You have inflation number one at 37%, which has been the highest recorded in the poll and was the same back in October. So again, the inflation pain point is number one. Number two is healthcare. And I know from other research done is that when drilling down into it, it's not access to care or quality care, it's really cost of care. So whether it's your medical prices or medical insurance pricing, that's really the big pain point. Government corruption, I'd say it's almost a pocketbook too, because again, you have what you're getting hit spending wise, but also, hey, the government needs to kind of rein in the government corruption and kind of the wastefulness that they've been doing. And then the economy is number 4. And you notice that everything after that, you had immigration number 5, but everything else below that, like kind of all the social issues have really taken a back seat. So if you have the main takeaway to see right now, the electorate, it's pocketbook. It's the economy, stupid, as you've heard some folks say in the past. I mean, that's 100% what we're seeing right now. And I think that's going to be the dominant issue heading the election. Whichever party can, I guess, best address those concerns among voters is going to be doing well come November.
And one of the questions you also asked in the most recent polling data, again, you can find at thecentersquare.com, is about the direction of the country. And seems to kind of go hand in hand as well with the approval rating of Donald Trump. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so Donald Trump's approval rating is not too far off from the direction of the country, but also just the electorate. What does this data point mean? It means, hey, are folks optimistic or pessimistic about the direction? And currently, their majority of the electorate is pessimistic. But also, we've kind of been in this state for the last 8 to 10 years. Just look at the past elections for president. I mean, you had Trump was elected initially, and then Biden won, and then you had Trump won again. But also, all three of those presidencies, they all won with roughly 50% of the vote. But within a year into their term, all three of them had really terrible job approval ratings. So they really sank. And it's just kind of like you have an A-B choice between the red team and blue team, or Republican, Democrat. And so folks just really are unhappy. So the pendulum going back between the parties, it used to go longer, 8-year terms, et cetera. But now it's just kind of bouncing back and forth because there's really not a third option, but they're really not happy with either of the sides these days.
Well, I think that leads us to, breaking down and drilling down into who exactly is answering questions from your polls. And let's talk about those true independents, that swing voter, so to speak, and how crucial they are to determining the wins of the country.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny for a lot of folks. I get, politics is basically a full contact sport for I like to call it for nerds, right? And so when you look at this, is that these two teams are competing, is that, what's funny is that a lot of the die is already cast when it comes to electoral outcomes. I mean, you hear a term a lot used by consultants, Democrats vote Democrat, Republicans vote Republican, and you battle for the folks in the middle. Thing is, in this really hyper polarized time frame that we're in, is that if you look at the overall electorate, especially you find it through the generic ballot, like, hey, do you normally vote for Republican or Democrat? I mean, usually about 85% of them are picking either Democrat or Republican. So that 10 to 15% that's left in the middle, what we like to call true independents, that don't lean one side or the other, like they're pretty party agnostic. I mean, that's what this poll captures, and they ultimately are the ones that decide the general election. So again, the calculus is, hey, you want to turn out your base, right? Make sure they're motivated, they get out to vote. And then the other portion is, hey, win those folks in the middle that are small but mighty. But that group in the middle, that disenfranchised 10, 15%, they've chosen who the president has been the last 3 elections in a row. And again, they're not happy. And this poll is one of the unique polls that actually has a large sample size of this very hard to reach group, where we can track them over time to see where the political winds are blowing with them. So again, it's super unique, but I hope that explains it a little bit.
No, absolutely. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, again, as we get through this election year, maybe right before the election, what some of the sentiments are. And we'll be looking at Mike Noble, the CEO and founder of Noble Predictive Insights, and all the data that you're able to produce from reaching out to that broad base of individuals answering these types of questions and what's on the minds of voters. Greatly appreciate you taking time with us here today for the Center Square Daily. And now it's time for America's Talking, with headlines from across the country. In Minnesota, the free speech group raising concerns about a package of bills regulating artificial intelligence, warning the proposals could have unintended consequences for Minnesotans' constitutional rights. The Center Square's Elise Apel reports a bipartisan group of state lawmakers introduced a package of AI-related bills addressing healthcare decisions, children's access to chatbots, pricing, and government surveillance. The broader effort also includes a proposed amendment to the state constitution to address artificial intelligence. Supporters say the measure is intended to clarify that artificial intelligence itself doesn't have constitutional speech rights, but critics warn the language could affect the free speech of those who use artificial intelligence. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, protecting drivers' rights to own any type of vehicle so desired, whether gas-powered, diesel, hybrid, or electric, cleared a major legislative hurdle Monday. The Center Square's regional editor, Kristen Smith, reports the state Senate there approved a bill that bans vehicle purchase mandates 28 to 22, with one Republican and one Democrat defecting on the Republican-backed measure. Senator Camera Bartolata, she introduced the legislation in July before receiving a party-line vote in the Senate, and that was in a transportation committee last year. She said Senate Bill 990 is very simple, quote, it would ban the mandate of the sale of any specific vehicle in the Commonwealth. 13 states have passed similar legislation, while another 5 are considering it. The bill awaits consideration in the Democrat-led House of Representatives, where support is outweighed. A staff member of California Senator Anna Caballero physically blocked the Center Square Monday from approaching the senator and asking questions about her recent bill concerning child abuse cases. The Center Square's Madeline Shannon reports she was wearing press credentials and was waiting in a common area at the Capitol when Caballero and the staff member exited an elevator. At the same time, another staff member left the senator's and her staff's office, and he entered the hallway that leads to Caballero's office. This was the staff member who blocked the reporter from approaching Caballero in the hallway as the Senate headed towards the office, which was just around the corner. The staffer in question would not give his name, but said Caballero's staff made it clear that she would not answer questions about her bill. The Center Square also tried to ask questions of Caballero's bill and about her bill during a Senate floor session scheduled Monday afternoon, but she declined to answer questions during and after floor session on Monday. Be sure to watch for the Center Square, California, for the latest on that story. And as Virginia lawmakers wrapped up work on firearm legislation before adjournment, they considered an ultimately rejected substitute language in House Bill 110 that Republicans said would have given General Assembly members different treatment if a bill dealing with handguns left in unattended vehicles. The Center Square's Shirlene Guerrero reports House Bill 110 in Virginia would prohibit a person from leaving behind a visible handgun in an unattended motor vehicle and impose a civil penalty of up to $500 if the bill was signed into law. A conference report substitute included language Republicans objected to, but that language was not included in the final version approved by both chambers. Final action of House Bill 110 came as lawmakers wrapped up work on a broader package of firearm-related bills sent to the first Democratic governor, Abigail Spanberger. The package includes measures on assault weapons and magazine bans, firearm industry civil liability, ghost gun serialization, a carry ban on public property, safe storage where minors or prohibited persons are present, and the domestic violence firearm removal process. So be watching the Center Square, Virginia, for the latest there. And with the latest on what's happening in Congress, including where funding for the TSA stands, we're joined now by Therese Boudreau with the very latest. Therese, thanks for taking time with us. Obviously, we've got people that are wanting to take part and travel to get to their spring break destinations, but they may have to face those long lines. A lot of questions about, is TSA going to be funded? What's the latest?
Well, the latest is that, unfortunately, there's not really progress on negotiations. So the White House last night, they introduced another counteroffer. They sent another counteroffer to Democrats. They've essentially, some of the demands that Democrats have, they've said, okay, we'll grant those, but we're not granting all of them. So they're said that they're willing to implement body cameras. They said, and this is a quite a notable backtrack, is they're saying, okay, fine, we'll say that certain sensitive locations like schools or daycares are going to be off limits for immigration enforcement officers. And so they've really they've tried to reach out and to find a compromise. But Democrats are saying that unless they get all of those demands that they have, which we covered at the Center Square, that they're not going to back down. They specifically want to see a requirement that agents get a judicial warrant on top of an immigration court warrant when they enter private property and arrest somebody. So the latest in the House is that House Democrats are introducing a discharge petition, which essentially, if you get enough votes in the House, at this point, Democrats would need 4 Republicans to join them. then you can force a vote on a piece of legislation. And that legislation is a proposal to fund all of DHS for the year, which would open up TSA and FEMA and these other agencies that are running on low staff and unpaid staff. You would open all of those DHS agencies except for Customs and Border Patrol and ICE. And Democrats argue that by doing that, you can alleviate the worst effects of the DHS shutdown on the American people, and that lawmakers can, after that, come together and continue to try to find a compromise on immigration enforcement funding. But it's been over a month now. This is the third longest shutdown that includes either partial or full. This is a partial one in American history. And so that's a record that's not really great for Congress to be breaking, but that's where we're at right now.
I understand, there's an argument about Congress has the power of the purse because they control how much money's appropriated, as we're seeing play out now. But surely that's, growing some frustrations among Republicans in Congress. How are they reacting to this ongoing delay? And are they being impacted by long lines at airports?
Oh, they're certainly unhappy about it. I mean, House Speaker Mike Johnson, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, they're accusing Democrats of essentially at this point, because this is the second time Democrats have done this, of using or instigating a government shutdown in order to force policy priorities. And Democrats do acknowledge this, so that they'll argue that, Republicans' refusal to only fund part of DHS is also, using this issue, taking it hostage. But Republicans are very unhappy. And they refuse to agree to anything less than funding the entire Department of Homeland Security, especially since it should have been funded in October. Congress is very late to funding the federal government for fiscal year 2026, which began this last October. And so they're really, at this point, if they actually want to fund the government properly, by the time they pass the DHS bill, and that takes care of the last of the appropriations bills for the year, they have, a few months that will be in effect, and then they're supposed to figure out a plan to redo the whole thing for fiscal year 2027. Now, they probably won't. They'll probably pass a continuing resolution to keep funds on cruise control. But essentially, Congress is just, whenever it comes to funding the government, it's a really difficult thing for them to do, essentially. And so it's, again, there's not really much progress. Republicans are annoyed. Democrats are also annoyed. And we're on day 32, I believe, of the shutdown.
Yeah, the taxpayers definitely feeling it, and they're paying for all of
Yes.
it, but they're also having to pay that time tax of certain airports getting through security when, as you mentioned, security is low staffed and TSA not getting paychecks. So interesting to see how these various gears of Congress are moving and working against each other at times, and the people who are stuck in the middle of that being those taxpayers. Therese, you're obviously watching a lot of what's going on in Congress, and we've got a marathon debate that's starting about voter ID in the U.S. Senate. How long do we anticipate that they're actually going to be debating whether or not people should show voter ID when they go to the polls?
So the estimate right now is that it'll take at least a week, probably 10 days. The interesting about this marathon debate is that it is essentially a hybrid talking filibuster. So a lot of, well, actually a small amount, but very vocal Republicans have wanted Thune to institute or to revive the talking filibuster, which would force senators to hold the floor and try to convince other lawmakers to either vote for or against the bill. And whenever they can't do that anymore, the 60 vote threshold would no longer apply. So basically that 60 vote threshold would only apply to a bill if senators are able to hold the floor. And then it would just be a majority vote, which Republicans could then, they could use that to pass the legislation. But Thune is wary about that. He says there's not enough support. So he's doing this hybrid talking filibuster, which means that the bill is still going to need 60 votes at the end of the day or at the end of the week at this point in order to pass, which means it likely won't pass. But it does give lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats, the chance to really speak either for or against the bill. So Republicans are saying that they're going to use this time to force Democrats to explain why they won't vote for this bill that polls show the provisions in this bill, 80%, 70% of Americans support. And Democrats are saying that they'll use this time to, force Republicans to go on the record about things that they see as controversial on the bill. So in many ways, it's not very useful. There are many people, many lawmakers who have kind of said privately to reporters that they're not even quite sure why they're doing this, because the end result is still going to be the same, most likely, that the bill is not going to pass, because it's highly unlikely that 7 Democrats are going to join Republicans in order to pass this. So it's kind of just show is what a lot of people are thinking.
And I think not being very useful is how some may characterize all of Congress in the past few years. So it's fascinating to see. They're going to go through this exercise, and there's going to be a lot of cameras on it. There's going to be a lot of ink spilled in the press about it, and a lot of talk about it as well. But how's the president reacted to this idea of it still having to take that 60 vote threshold with this hybrid talking filibuster?
So the president was very supportive of a full talking filibuster, because, again, that's probably the only way that this legislation can pass the Senate. It's already passed the House, but in the Senate, it needs 60 votes. So he has actually said that he's not going to sign any bill besides a bill that would fund the Department of Homeland Security until the Save America Act is on his desk. And so, that does complicate things. Now, if a bill has been put on the president's desk, it's been passed by both chambers of Congress, and the president doesn't do anything about it, it will automatically take effect after 10 days. But it still is yet another delay on a lot of the activities of Congress. And this is what we've kind of seen from the 119th Congress. We've had this very partisan atmosphere, and there have been so many different projects and partisan bills have taken up a lot of time. And so you have things like funding the government that have kind of suffered because of that. And then, as we're seeing with DHS, even that process becomes very partisan when there's something that comes up. So the president is not happy about it, but in some ways there's only so much he can do, because Thune would need a lot of support from Republicans in order to institute that talking filibuster, which he simply does not have. Again, there's a very vocal minority of Republicans who want it, but not the majority.
It's obviously an election year as well, and you've got candidates for the U.S. Senate being asked about the filibuster, and many of them pushing back on ending it, saying it's important that we don't have, as we've talked with Illinois Senate candidates here in Illinois, it doesn't give you that pendulum swinging back and forth with different types of legislation for just whoever has control of the Senate. And Therese, all of this happening in an election year, but it's also the 250th birthday of the United States. And I can't believe we're already, way past the midway point of March. So July 4th is coming up pretty quick. We'll see if there can be any unity in Congress in the next few months to see if we can celebrate that 250th anniversary all together, or if we're still going to be at each other's throats in Congress. So greatly appreciate your time. We'll be checking back in with you in the days ahead as you continue to watch what's going on the U.S. Senate floor about this issue. Education reporter Esther Wickham takes a look at the increased scrutiny around the amount of taxpayer subsidies being given to non-citizen students, and she joins us now for the Center Square Daily. Esther, what are we finding out about this issue, and just how pervasive is it across the country?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So July of last year, in 2025, the Trump administration, first of all, since joining his second term, has definitely put a priority on cracking down on exactly what is America, spending its money on, what are taxpayers, getting that return on investment for how much money they're putting towards, especially in the category of education. And so we're seeing across the country now this renewed debate around, taxpayer-funded financial aid when it comes to illegal immigrant students. How much money are they getting from the federal government, and now specifically state aid going towards illegal immigrant students' education? And so over the last year, the U.S. Department of Education has kind of rolled back this decades-old policy that now requires, stricter eligibility for federally funded education programs. And so essentially this would require, verification, identity verification, so that U.S. citizens can actually get the federal education funding that they need. Since for so long there hasn't been that requirement restriction, and so now we're kind of keeping tabs on what's actually going on when it comes to federal education as well as state aid. And within the reporting, since this has been rolled back, we're seeing a lot of states pop up with various programs, and the programs have been around for decades, but now they're kind of under a stricter scrutiny within the federal government, as well as state officials and education officials kind of questioning what is this money going towards, and is it actually impacting and helping U.S. citizens, or is it going towards illegal immigrant students? And from what we've seen, there are around 17 to 19 states, including Washington, D.C., that have some sort of state-funded financial aid to illegal immigrant students. And usually this is tied to residency or graduating from local high schools. So these kinds of students, are actually going to American schools and wanting to go to local community colleges or state universities, but programs, for example, like the California Dream Act application, as well as other programs we see in Colorado, Texas, New York, Illinois. These kinds of programs kind of allow students who don't have the documentation, that aren't U.S. citizens, so they're illegal immigrant students trying to get education. They don't have to apply for FAFSA. They can get these state aid financial aid to attend the university that they want without having to go to the federal government to prove identification.
And as you said, California Dream Act, you've got the Colorado application for state financial aid, you've got the Illinois Monetary Award Program that's been expanded, New York's Dream Act, just to name a few of the upwards to 19 different states or jurisdictions with these types of programs. How much is this costing taxpayers?
Yeah, so a study by the Federation for American Immigration Reform estimated, and Greg, you got to keep in mind, this is not just undergrad or higher education. This is estimating education as a whole. Illegal immigrants total around $5.7 billion nationally, and the largest portion of the fiscal impact are on state and local budgets. And so when you think about this study kind of on a macro scale, this is how much is going towards students that are not U.S. citizens, and you kind of think about the impact of what is that happening to taxpayers, and how is that impacting U.S. citizens and students that want to go to university and are trying to get that financial aid to be able to do that.
Esther, you talked to a couple of different people on this story on both sides, and you can kind of glean a little bit of what the debate's really about and kind of where the line is drawn in the sand for each side of this. Tell us what you found out from the Freedom Foundation.
Yeah, so I spoke with Rusty Brown. He's the director of special projects for the Freedom Foundation, and something he highlights, which I think everyone can recognize and have sympathy for this kind of situation, is it's a really complex issue. A lot of these students, these illegal immigrant students, didn't really choose to be here, didn't necessarily bring themselves over here. This is kind of a result of family or friends and kind of put them in this situation, and they're maybe trying to do the best that they can. And he acknowledges that this is complex and it's hard to kind of deny education to children maybe trying to do the right thing. And so it's definitely a moral issue, but you also have to raise the question of taxpayer dollars and how that's impacting American citizens. And so something he kind of emphasizes in one of his quotes, he says, if you're helping illegal immigrants, then what are you doing is cutting off funding that could be going to helping Americans' kids, and especially impoverished school districts. And there should be a focus on America first. So, you want to recognize this is a complex issue, and it's really hard to quantify every situation. And but at the end of the day, this is America. We want to focus on our school districts that are struggling financially, and the students that maybe are super smart, but they just didn't get the same opportunities as other kids. And, they were born here, they're U.S. citizens, and they kind of deserve the right to get that state aid or that federal financial aid to go to the college of their dreams. But on the flip side, had a lot of conversations with various school districts, specifically in California, the California Dream Act application, talking to the state of California. Their response is, well, undocumented students, are American students. They're taxpayers. Their parents are taxpayers. They deserve to have a seat at the table as well. And so you kind of have to figure out, okay, how much are they paying compared to U.S. citizens, to taxpayers who have been here, born and raised here, and is that quantifiable for them to have a seat at the table and have access to those state education funds as well?
And you also talked to the chief communications officer for Colorado's Department of Higher Education, giving a bit of a perspective as to a payor of this who's giving these funds and these resources to these types of students. What did they have to say?
Yeah, so in her response in an email, she kind of said, when taxpayers express concerns about how public funds are used, the higher education department refers to legislation indicating Colorado students who, graduate from high school or earn their high school equivalency, they should also be awarded state-funded financial aid. And so kind of her response in explanation is saying, look, these taxpayers may be rightly concerned about what's actually happening with the money that they're contributing through their paycheck every 2 weeks or every month. But at the end of the day, what specifically the Colorado Department of Higher Education is going to focus on is legislation. And if we're seeing these students, attend these high schools, follow the requirements and apply through our application process, providing the necessary details that according to the law says they need, then they have every right to this legislation, and they have every right to this funding. And if they want to go to a state school or community college, then they have the ability to do that. And so kind of going back to that idea of, it's definitely a complex issue to try and figure out how do we quantify, like whether we allow some people but not other people to get financial aid. But it goes back to that question of, are we valuing and prioritizing America first and America's students when it comes to this state aid, and how is that getting trumped or devalued compared to these illegal immigrant students entering the education system?
Well, $5.7 billion of taxpayer funds going to this. You could see why that's a big issue, and something that the Trump administration has an eye on, and the ongoing conversation with 50 different states on how to address this. Obviously, that's a lot more that you're going to be reporting on, Esther. Greatly appreciate you taking the time with us here for the Center Square Daily.